Well, voters went to the polls Tuesday for primaries in 7 states, but we begin today's show in California with 2 closely watched races there. In San Francisco, voters supported a multi-million-dollar funded effort to recall progressive prosecutor Chesa Boudin as district attorney of San Francisco. Boudin aimed to reform the criminal justice system, but faced mounting attacks by the real estate industry. Boudin told supporters Tuesday night he would not stop fighting for restorative justice.
This recall started, my wife Valerie said to me, "I know we're going to win." Yes. And she's right. She's always right. And the reason I knew and I know today that she was right is because this was never about one vote count. It was never about one election night party. It was never about specifically which person gets to be in the office of the district attorney. This is a movement, not a moment in history. I want to be very clear about what happened tonight. The right-wing billionaires outspent us 3-1. They exploited an environment in which people are appropriately upset. And they created an electoral dynamic where we were literally shadow boxing. Voters were not asked to choose between criminal justice reform and something else. They were given an opportunity to voice their frustration and their outrage, and they took that opportunity.
Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, the mayoral race is now down to a billionaire and a longtime progressive lawmaker. Billionaire real estate developer Rick Caruso and former Congressmember Karen Bass are headed to a runoff in November after placing first and second in Tuesday's primary. Caruso is a Republican-turned-Democrat who sits on the board of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. He spent some $40 million of his own fortune on the race and could spend much more in the general election. Congressmember Bass, former Congressmember Bass, is attempting to become the first woman, the first black woman as well, to lead the second-largest city in the United States.
Tonight, the city will see that it's hard to defeat a people-powered campaign. It's hard to defeat passionate door knockers, no matter how much money is spent. And it's hard to defeat folks who are committed to a cause, not just a candidate.
That's mayoral candidate Karen Bass addressing supporters last night in Los Angeles. But for more, we go to San Francisco to speak with Lara Bazelon, professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, where she's director of the school's criminal and juvenile justice and racial justice law clinics. She's also chair of San Francisco DA Chesa Boudin's Innocence Commission, which she wrote about in a San Francisco Chronicle piece headlined, "My team set an innocent man free under Chesa Boudin's guidance. Let us keep working." Well, can you talk, Professor Bazelon, about what happened last night, about the whole recall effort that succeeded in ousting Chesa Boudin as the DA of San Francisco?
Yes, and good morning, Amy. I think what happened was a perfect storm because you had, as Chesa said in his concession speech, millions of dollars, I think over $7 million being poured into the effort to recall him. And I think that money bought a lot of ads and messaging around this idea that everything that San Franciscans are feeling about being unsafe, about rising burglary and auto crimes had to do with Chesa Boudin, and that if they could just sort of vent their frustrations and recall him, they were going to wake up the next day magically with some kind of a better outcome. And I think that that messaging is false, and that San Franciscans are going to be pretty disappointed to find out that they're waking up today with the same mayor, the same grossly incompetent police department that has a 9% clearance rate, and really messengers who are telling them that returning to tough on crime policies are going to be the answer to the myriad of problems the city faces, many of which are not even in the purview of the district attorney's office.
And Professor Bazelon, this whole issue of getting tougher on crime, the perception of increases in crime, what are the actual statistics, crime statistics in terms of of San Francisco in recent years? And also, my understanding is that there's been a sharp drop in the number of arrests that the police have been conducting in recent years.
I'll take the last part of that question first. That's absolutely correct. So the clearance rate, which means the arrests that they're able to bring to the DA's office for prosecution, has dropped to below 9% for most crimes. And it's at about 1% for auto burglaries, which perhaps is the most triggering issue for San Franciscans. So, of course, what that means is that if I were to go out and commit one of these crimes, and I don't intend to, I have somewhere between a 91 and a 99% chance of not even being arrested. And of course, the DA can't prosecute people who the police don't arrest. And I feel like if we were going to have an honest conversation about crime, the conversation would stop right there. And the buck would stop with the mayor, who, of course, appointed the police chief. But broadly speaking, in terms of is crime rising in San Francisco, it's really a mixed bag. Some crimes have dropped. Other crimes have risen, but not at all in the statistically exponential way that we've seen in cities, for example, like Sacramento, which has had a huge spike in murders and violent crimes. Ours has been relatively small. It's less about what the actual statistics say than about how people feel. And that is what I continued to hear in the weeks leading up to the recall is friends and neighbors and the pediatrician, whoever, telling me, I've been a victim of a crime, or I know somebody who had their car broken into, and I don't feel safe. And that, I think, was the message, and that really the recall supporters were able to capitalize on. That was the thing that resounded and resonated with voters, because that's how they've been feeling. And so the problem is that statistics are really important, but at the same time, when you tell someone you don't have a reason to be that worried because property crime is only up by 1%, that's not going to be a message that's going to resonate with someone who just had their car broken into.
And we've mentioned the role of the real estate industry, but what about the police themselves? Weren't they essentially sworn enemies of Chesa Boudin? And to what degree did the police unions play a role in these elections?
The police unions played a huge role. I want to back up for a second because you did mention some of these special interests. One of the things that Chesa Boudin did was he instituted prosecutions against wage theft, against the misclassification of workers. Those are the kinds of things that happen routinely in the tech industry. And so he made enemies with very, very deep pockets. But yes, to go back to the dysfunctionality in the police department, that has been a long-term problem. It predated Chesa Boudin, and it's interesting. Some of them will tell you, oh, well, there's no point in arresting because he won't prosecute, as if he wouldn't prosecute a serious violent crime or send somebody to something like diversion for a less serious crime. So it's not true, but they've also been peddling that message for decades, really. When Kamala Harris was the DA, they routinely told people, oh, we're not going to arrest because San Francisco juries don't convict. And as for the POA, they have been a sworn enemy of Chesa Boudin from the very beginning of his campaign. And in fact, towards the end of it, in 2019, they dumped $700,000 into attack ads. One thing I think they did that was smart was that they stayed behind the scenes because they are detested in the city of San Francisco.
And let's be clear. I mean, Chesa Boudin has been under pressure from the beginning because they first attempted to get enough signatures to recall him before. They didn't do that, and then they've done this. So the power of money right now in elections in California, of course, it's the case all over the country, Lara. In a moment, we want to talk about Karen Bass and who she is up against, a billionaire Republican turned Democrat. But before we end on this issue, I wanted to ask you about the Innocence Commission that Chesa Boudin set up, how unusual it is, you also an expert in restorative justice.
Thank you so much for asking. This is perhaps the achievement that he is the most proud of, and I know that I am too. To sort of give you a context, we're known as a liberal city, but in the entire history of San Francisco, there had never been a collaborative exoneration of an innocent person. And what I mean by that is that traditionally, when people in San Francisco claimed to be wrongfully convicted, the DA's response was to double and triple down and insist that they were guilty and force these people to fight for years to get out. They would then turn around and sue the city and cost taxpayers millions of dollars. And when Chesa took office, there was a conviction review unit that was supposed to be evaluating these claims objectively. They had exonerated no one. So his response was to create an independent commission, there's 5 of us, and it is my honor to chair it. And what we do, we work pro bono, and we reinvestigate these cases from the ground up. We review thousands of pages of documents. We interview witnesses. We retain experts and listen to their opinions. And then at the end of that, we transmit our findings to the DA. And obviously, of course, at the end, it's the DA's decision. Our first case concluded in April. A man named Joaquin Syria was exonerated after spending 32 years in prison for a murder that another man committed. And this is just one of the many reforms that I think is so important and really only came about because San Franciscans had the vision and the courage to elect someone who was truly progressive. And as I said in my op-ed, I'm very worried that our work is on the chopping block and that whoever comes in, and mind you, this is someone who the mayor will appoint, who almost certainly will bring in tough on crime policies to try to capitalize that in the election we're having in November, will either disband us or stack us with people who really aren't interested in doing that job. And that concerns me and makes me deeply sad.
And what is, I wanted to ask you this whole issue of the recall movement. California, of course, is famous for recalls. What's the impact of these recall movements in terms of a democratic process of someone who's elected to office having to constantly battle to be thrown out?
They are, in my opinion, toxic. When we enacted this mechanism, it was supposed to be a bulwark against fraud and malfeasance, and it's really been weaponized. At this point, we're using it to recall judges who hand down sentencing decisions we don't like, to go after the governor out of frustration over his COVID policies, to go after this DA, potentially to go after the district attorney in Los Angeles. I know we're going to be talking about the political climate there, and it's similar. And the message really to elected officials is that they have to watch their back at all times and hold up their finger to the wind at all times. And that's really, really disheartening, because what we want are people who run on a platform and deliver on that platform, which is precisely what Chesa Boudin did, and then look at this outcome.
Before we wrap, we want to get to Los Angeles. The mayoral race, it'll pit 2 Democrats against each other. Well, Karen Bass, longtime Democrat, former Congressmember, versus a Republican, Rick Caruso, billionaire, who just became a Democrat. He spent $40 million just on the primary. He's on the board of the Reagan Library. Can you talk about the significance of what's happening in the power of money?
I don't think, Amy, that you can overstate the significance of money. I mean, we just talked about the $7 million that was dumped into the recall in San Francisco. Mr. Caruso, and as you say, he was a Republican until about 5 minutes ago, dumped $40 million of his own money into trying to win the mayoral race. And I don't think that anyone believes that he would be in the position that he's in without that money, and using that money again to sell sort of a similar tough on crime, we need to end progressive reform message. And so at this point, he's actually leading in the polls against Congresswoman Karen Bass, who I think was really expected to kind of walk away from the whole thing in the lead, and at least a few months ago. And it'll be really interesting to see what the political climate is like in November when they go head to head. And of course, when they do, he's going to have this astronomical financial advantage.
And of course,
I wanted to ask you, in terms of that, a key situation there in Los Angeles will be how Latino voters decide between the 2 candidates, because Kevin De Leon, who was another candidate, had a remarkably poor showing, about 7% of the vote, but clearly he still has influence, and he hasn't yet announced who he's supporting in that race.
Yes, that is absolutely right. That is a critical voting bloc. And I think they're going to be fighting over trying to get the support of that voting bloc. Absolutely. And of course, it's not monolithic either. So it's a tricky balance.
Well, we want to thank you, Lara Bazelon, professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, chair of the Innocence Commission, author of the book Rectify, The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction. Next up, President Biden is heading to Los Angeles for the Summit of the Americas today, as Mexico, the Mexican president, skips the event, joined by Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Bolivia, to protest the exclusion of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. We'll be back with more.